All right, so picking back up in our study, I believe we left off last week in verse 12. Now remember, in 2 Samuel chapter 5, I've got this section entitled King David's First Victories, in part because this is, in chapter 5, the first time where David has basically been anointed as the king over all of Israel. Right? Because at this point, Ishbosheth's dead, Abner's dead. Abner had helped bring the rest of the tribes of Israel under the leadership of David, and now David is the sole king of Israel. And we talked about last week one of the first things that David did in order to, in a way, help establish his rule throughout Israel was he decided to go and build a new capital. And he did that in which city? Right, he does that in Jerusalem. Originally, when he was just the leader over the southern portion of Judah, his capital was in Hebron. But now he moves his capital up to Jerusalem, again a more central location. And a lot of times, in most places, in countries and states, generally the capital city is often located sort of in the middle part of the state. Now, of course, we talked about how David did have a victory in taking Jerusalem, right? Taking it from the Jebusites, a people that we remember in the book of Joshua. Joshua was very clear that this was a particular city that the Israelites did not take until the time of David. And so David builds a new capital, as we saw in verse 10. God continues to be with David. That'll come out when we look at the end of the chapter. And in verses 11 and 12, David forms a partnership with the king of Tyre, Hiram. And you remember we talked about this last week, how this is very important to the city of Tyre, the inhabitants of Tyre, because they were a merchant people. That's what their economy was based on: trading, selling goods and services throughout the Mediterranean coast. So the king of Hiram establishes an alliance with David because there was an important trading route that went through Egypt, up through Israel, and into the land of Phoenicia. And so Hiram establishes that relationship with David. He also provides David with the trees necessary to build, as it says in verse 11, the house of David, and later on the temple of the Lord. In the very last verse, we just simply noted that David at this point, because of all these things that had worked out for him, because of his patience, allowing God to do the work, and then David acting when it was necessary, all these things had led him to, at this point, recognizing and being in the position that he is the king over all of Israel. Now, what we pick up in verse 13, verses 13 through 16 is what's called a summation. Basically, what this means is that verses 13 and 16 did not all immediately happen right after this event. It basically just sums up the rule of David. And in this case, it sums up the history of David's family, in a sense, at least the birth records of his family in the city of Jerusalem. Now note verse 13. It says that David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he was come from Hebron, and there were yet sons and daughters born to David. Now again, the focus is on the children that David has. Now remember that David already has children based on his time in Hebron. And we've noted that in the Old Testament earlier in the book of 1 and 2 Samuel. This would have been the sons Absalom, Amnon, and the others, who we'll read about later on. But these are children that are born in the city of Jerusalem, one of which we know pretty well. Now, in the Old Testament law, if you go back and look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, there was basically a list of regulations or a list of commands that a righteous king was supposed to follow by. And even though David's a man after God's own heart, this is something that David did have his faults with, as we see throughout the book. But look for a moment at Deuteronomy 17, verse 17. Deuteronomy 17, verse 17. Right, and these are, again, statements made about the king. Verse 17, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. Now, technically, there is a difference between a concubine and wife, but you do notice again that he took not just more concubines, but also wives out of Jerusalem. And as the writer indicates there could be problems when a king did this. And we see those problems come out later on in the book. We will especially see those problems come out with the reign of David's son Solomon towards the end of his rule. Now, a lot of times, kings would often do this practice, take more concubines and wives. This was a symbol of status. It was a symbol of power. Kings were known to do this, and I'm not saying why David does this or not, but in a general sense, kings often did this because this was, again, a sign of status and a sign of power. And of course, having more offspring as a king was a very important thing. Now note verse 14. These are the names of the children born. And these be the names of those that were born unto him in Jerusalem: Shemuah, and Shobab, and Nathan, and Solomon, and Ibhar also, Elishua, and Nepheg, and Japhia, and Elishama, and Eliada, and Eliphalet. I should have got Dad to read that. Or Mom, yeah. Now, most of these names we don't know, or we're not that familiar with. Now, I will mention here that if you want a parallel passage to this, 1 Chronicles 14 covers a lot of the same events, which we may refer to that chapter in a minute. But 1 Chronicles actually covers a lot of these same events. And it also records the names there. The names might be a little bit different. At least the spelling may be a little bit different with those names. Now, of course, we know one of these sons very well, the last one there mentioned in verse 14 being Solomon, who would eventually become the third king, sole king over Israel, and of course would have problems later on with have problems because of women leading him away from God to turn to idolatry. All right. Which of David's sons was Jesus a descendant of? There's a reason why I asked this question. Which of these sons of David was Jesus a descendant of? It was Solomon. It was Solomon. All right. Now, which of the sons of David was Jesus a blood descendant of? It is a trick question. There's a reason why I asked this question. Which of the sons of David was Jesus a blood descendant of? That means that his bloodline traced through this son. There's a reason why I asked this question. I think this is kind of interesting to point out, but we'll see if y'all could figure this out. Okay? It's actually not Solomon. Let's look at Matthew 1 verse 6 and Luke 3:31. I didn't really recognize this until I was studying over this, but I thought this was pretty interesting. Turns out that David is a descendant of two of the sons of David. Or Jesus is a descendant of two of the sons of David. All right, so Matthew chapter 1, verse 6. In Matthew chapter 1, you have a genealogy based on the ancestry of Joseph, right? David's earthly father. Now note Matthew chapter 1, verse 6. Jesse begat David the king, and David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah, or Bathsheba. So in a sense, Jesus' ancestry did trace through the king of Solomon, through his father, his earthly father Joseph. But were Joseph and Jesus blood related? No, right? Jesus was born of a virgin, right? That's very important to remember. Jesus was not blood related to Joseph. Now look at Luke chapter 3, verse 31. In the book of Luke, this traces Jesus' genealogy, Jesus' ancestry through Now hang on a second. I may have that backwards. I think I have that right. Dad, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Luke 3 is the genealogy through Jesus' mother, is it not? I think that's right. I might have it backwards, but look at Luke 3:31. Which was the son of Maliah, which was the son of Menon, which was the son of Mattatha, which was the son of Nathan, which was the son of David. So the point being is that actually Jesus' ancestry traced back through both Solomon and Nathan. Now we don't talk a lot about Nathan, the son of David, but that is an interesting thing that Jesus' ancestry does trace back through both of these individuals. One on his earthly father Joseph's side, and then one on his mother Mary's side. But the overall point, I thought that was interesting to point out, but the overall point is that it's important for a king to have children because it means, and we talked about this before, but it means that a king has a very prosperous outlook for after he is gone. And not just after he's gone, but children are important to the king because they can be leaders within government. At times they can serve as generals, sort of like what Jonathan did. In fact, the writer of Psalm 127, verses 4 and 5, talks about that a man should be happy if his quiver is full of children. Using the analogy there, the metaphor of a archer with arrows. Just as an archer is happy with a large amount of arrows, so should a man be with having more children.
You know, Adam, that is interesting. I've never looked at it like that either, but you know it's always God's divine plan that way, and that way no matter which way us as men nowadays want to look at it, you're going to see that lineage.
Mm-hmm.
No matter which way you look through Joseph or Mary.
Mm-hmm.
So that is really interesting. Just kind of, I guess, something that debunks something that somebody trying to, act like it wasn't divine.
Right.
Planned by God.
Now, something else that I'll point out about that, it was important in the Jewish culture that at least when you think of terms of royalty or kingship, to have your father connected to the line of the king. So that's part of why it's pointed out there. I'll have to go back and look at that. But I believe that was the case. Matthew is Joseph's lineage, Jesus' father. I believe Luke is Mary's mother. Jesus' mother, Mary, her lineage. Now, that summation is ended. We return to sort of the immediate present at the time after David has taken the capital of Jerusalem. Now come back to Philistines. And this section is important because if you remember when we talked about the summation of Saul's kingship back at the end of 1 Samuel 14, the Philistines were the one enemy that Saul could never completely defeat. And while David's king, he's going to have constant success against the Philistines, beginning here in verse 17. But when the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines came up to seek David. And David heard of it and went down to the hold. Now, keep in mind from the perspective here of the Philistines, right? Israel has just been in a civil war. Perhaps the Philistines had desired that in the midst of the fighting that both those allied with Saul's house, those allied with David's house would fight against one another and weaken one another, and then it would be easy for the Philistines to come in and to take over. That sometimes happens in civil wars around the world. But we know, of course, that God was on the side of David. That did not happen. Yet the Israelites do attack, verse 17. Perhaps that's in response to some of the immediate actions that David has done. He's gone and conquered another city. He's established a new capital. He has, as you see in verse 9, right, he strengthened the city. He's building up Israel's defenses, so to speak. Not only that, he has established a relationship, a trading relationship with the king of Tyre. You think about this maybe in a sense of an alliance. And the point is that while the Philistines were wanting Israel to weaken as a result of this civil war, the end result is that Israel is prospering and strengthening under the leadership of David. And so you can almost think in your minds that the Philistines are sitting there thinking, we got to stop, we've got to attack them now before they become too powerful. And perhaps that's the mindset. So, verse 17 again, they hear about David becoming king over Israel. The Philistines come up to seek David, and David heard of it and went into the hold. Now, one thing that comes out in this passage here, at least in my mind, is that you notice that the Philistines, at least in my mind, I think the Philistines had a lot of respect for David. Notice here that all the Philistines came up to seek David. Right? That means the entire army of the Philistines came up to seek David. Now, you think about that, and you think about back at the end of 1 Samuel, when the Philistines were going to meet Saul, did the Philistines think that they needed all of their troops to be able to defeat Saul? No, right? Because David and his men were sent away. They didn't think they were necessary to be able to defeat Saul, but now maybe they have a great respect for David, at least in a sense of his military power, that they all went to try to seek David. And then David, it says there that he went down to the hold. More than likely, this is a reference to the city of Jerusalem, which he has again strengthened. Now, a lot of people would look at this as a way of cowardice, right? Some people might look at this as an act of cowardice on the part of David. The people came up, the armies come up to meet you. Basically, you're not going out to meet them, you're retreating back into the stronghold. That looks like a very a weak move to do that. But instead we're going to see that David does this not out of a position of weakness, but out of a position of spiritual strength. Let's go ahead and read down through verse 20. The Philistines also came up and spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up to the Philistines? Will you deliver them into mine hand? And the Lord said unto David, Go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into thine hand. So David does not retreat or doesn't go into the stronghold, not there to do this as an act of cowardice, but as you note, verse 19, he does this to inquire of God, what is my next step? Shall I go up to the Philistines? Will you deliver them into mine hand? And the Lord said unto David, Go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into thine hand. And as we've seen on other occasions before, when God made that promise to the leaders of Israel, He kept that promise. And that was the end result of the matter. But again, you think back to verse 17, people would have looked at David's decision here as a decision of weakness. You think about the application here. Whenever we get into, whenever we get into arguments with others, and hopefully it never turns into a matter of blows of the fist, so to speak. But there are a lot of people in life that whenever they get challenged, whenever somebody makes them angry, the natural reaction is to immediately act, to try to match their aggression or to match their anger. If they throw a punch at you, their first immediate reaction is to throw a punch back. Because for a lot of people, that's a sign of strength. Somebody throws a punch at you and you don't throw a punch back, it makes you look weak. We were, in our history class, we were talking about in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King believed in a nonviolent approach. And there was one occasion where he was actually giving a speech and a man came up and just punched him right in the face. And his response to the men that tried to go in after him was, just let him hit me again. Because the point is that his willingness to not throw a punch back had more of an impact than just turning it into an all-out brawl. Sometimes showing physical strength can be a sign of spiritual weakness in that sense. Now, of course, David would go on and attack, but not before he showed his spiritual strength, inquiring of God what he should do. And that's a good thought for us whenever we deal with people that we don't like. Again, somebody makes us mad, our first thing is to want to act right away. But perhaps the better thought is think to ourselves, as the popular phrase that used to be, what would Jesus do? What would the Bible say that I need to do in this situation? Think about that before I make a decision on how I respond to somebody that's angry or that has tried to hurt me. Because that can often lead to a better response. And David's inquiring of the Lord pays off. Verse 20, David came to Baal Perazim, and David smote them there and said, The Lord hath broken forth upon mine enemies before me, as the breach of waters. Therefore he called the name of that place Baal Perazim. Now David doesn't portray this as a small victory. Verse 20, he portrays it in the sense of a great flood. You think about how powerful a flood is. You think about in the book of Genesis. You think about the flood in the days of Noah that destroyed everything and everyone in the earth except for Noah and his sons and Noah and his family. A lot of times when you think about hurricanes, most people think about the wind speed and the rainfall. The most damaging thing from my understanding with hurricanes is the amount of flooding. That's what causes a lot of damage. And the point being is you think about the destructive nature of a flood. That's what God, not just David, but that's what God had done to the enemies of David here with the Philistines. And then verse 21, and there they left their images, and David and his men burned them. Of course, their gods were proven useless. Remember, we saw that in 1 Samuel 4, in 1 Samuel 5 with Dagon, right? That story where they put the Ark of the Covenant right next to Dagon. Dagon fell over. They come in the next day. They put Dagon back up on his little pedestal there. They come in the next morning, and Dagon, the idol, is completely in rubble, completely destroyed. So the Philistines know that their images had their idols, at least at this point, they understood that they had no power here. Now I'll point out in some translations, verse 21, I think some translations have it that David and his men carried them away, which that was often done in war, but the point was that David and his men if they did carry those idols away, they did so to burn them, not to worship them. And so, depending on your translation, verse 21, the end of it could be a little bit confusing. But let's go ahead and get through the end of the chapter. Right, so the Philistines, they don't learn their lesson. Philistines came up yet again and spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, Thou shalt not go up, but fetch a compass behind them, and come upon them over against the mulberry trees. And let it be, when thou hearest the sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees, that then thou shalt bestir thyself, for then shall the Lord go out before thee to smite the host of the Philistines. And David did so as the Lord had commanded him, and smote the Philistines from Geba until thou come to Gezer. Philistines attack again. But now notice what God says to David, right? David does the same thing. David goes and inquires of the Lord. David inquires of the Lord. The implication here is that David asks again, Shall I go up to them? Will you deliver them into mine hand? But note that God says here, Thou shalt not go up. In other words, you're not going to go meet them head to head, is the idea. You're not going to go meet them head to head in this particular case. Instead, you're going to attack them from behind. But fetch a compass behind, that just means to go around the back side of them and basically hit them from behind. Now this strategy works because of what God says in verse 24. And let it be, when thou hearest the sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees, that then thou shalt bestir thyself. Basically what happens here is that David and his men, they go around to the backside of the Philistine army, and then somehow God causes a sound to go through the mulberry trees in front of the Philistines, basically that causes them to go on the attack. And so the back part of the army is left vulnerable, is the idea. So whenever that sound happens, you will know that the Philistines are going to attack. They're going to be vulnerable on their rear. Then you come in, right? Then thou shalt bestir thyself, or you act, for then shall the Lord go out before thee to smite the host of the Philistines. That's when your time to attack is there. And so as verse 25 said, David did so as the Lord had commanded him. And the result is that the Philistines were smitten from Geba unto thou come to Gezer. Basically, the idea of these two cities here is basically the widespread destruction of the Philistines. It's a very significant victory. Now, what we take away from verses 17 through 25 is how important it is to follow the direct commands of God. First of all, I cannot follow the direct commands of God if I don't know what God says, right? David could have easily assumed that in this particular case, verses 22 through 25, I'll just go attack the Philistines like I did back in verse 17. Because it worked then, it's got to work now. But David thought to himself again, maybe I need to talk to God about this. Maybe I need to consult with God about this matter before I act. And notice, because David consults with God's word, God actually gives him a new command. Attack from behind. I'll cause a sound. They'll attack. They'll be vulnerable in the rear. You will be victorious. Now that all happened because David followed the direct commands of God. He didn't assume anything. Same thing is important for us as Christians when it comes to the commands of God given in the New Testament. We cannot assume anything, right? If we have a question about the matter, we don't need to make assumptions. We need to go to the Word of God and see what it says. We have to consult with God in order to make the best decision possible. Again, you think about this example and it naturally compares with what individual that spoke and struck a rock? Moses, right? God told him the first encounter, you can strike the rock. He did that. And Moses was rewarded. The second time, God told Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses struck it. And as a result, bitter water came out. Moses became unfavorable with God. And so the importance of verses 17 through 25 show us that when it comes to the commands of God, we have to inquire of God. We have to study and read what His Word says. But if we want to be pleasing to God, if we want things to turn out positively, spiritually, we've got to do exactly as God says, which is what David did here. The Israelites were successful. In a spiritual sense, we are successful too when we don't make assumptions if we have a question, but if we go and we find biblical evidence for carrying out the commands that we do. With that being said, our time's drawn to a close. Are there any comments or questions that you would like to add on to what we've talked about this morning?
I think about those images the Philistines had. They sort of, I guess, have the idea if we have these, there's no way we can lose. Much like the Israelites in the Ark of the Covenant, they felt like as long as they had that, there's no way they could lose. Like a lot of people today, they'll wear a cross around their neck. They have nothing to do with Jesus, but they have the idea as long as I wear this cross or I carry a copy of the Bible in the war, that I'll be protected. But they don't have, any use or time for the one who died on the cross or gave the word. So images are nothing if we don't worship the one, represented by the images of God.
Right. Really, really good point. And David would be different than the other Israelites. He often would not use the Ark of the Covenant sort of as like a good luck charm that the Israelites did. We'll pick up with chapter 6 next week. I'll try to go back and make sure that I had that right, but I believe that's the case about the difference between Matthew 1 and Luke 3 with the genealogies of Jesus. With that being said, we'll go ahead and draw our Bible class to a close at this point.